How do you think that a college actually works against the formation of long-lasting quality romantic relationships?
Yeah, you've got a pretty big obstacle in front of you because it seems like the time and place you would meet somebody, right? Looked into or brought up. There's something called the paradox of choice, as Barry Schwartz formulated it. And I think this is something that honestly the people of the ancient past essentially understood. Um, So if you look back, for example, at the Joseon dynasty, which is not really truly ancient, we're not going back to the Zhou dynasty, we're not going back thousands of years, we're going back half a thousand years. One of the early reforms they did was to separate um, male and female. And they did this at a pretty early age. They actually did this at around age 8, okay, which seems astonishing, right? Because you might be able to say, okay, I could kind of see why you would separate the teenagers because you've got the hormones and everything going on. But 8 years old, that seems pretty ridiculous, right? This is like second grade, or rather third grade for the most part. So that seems to be pretty early. But if you really think about it, you don't really have crushes until around 8 years old or older. Um, and then that's, of course, before, you grow into being a physical adult, aka puberty, right? So you don't have those hormones going yet, and yet you still kind of have these crushes, and you could kind of remember who's, who you had a little crush on, and that kind of thing. Um, because that actually does matter. Right? If you look at, if you look at the most popular film of all time, Gone with the Wind, which has made the most money of all time as well because they kept re-releasing it. The main character, Scarlett O'Hara, a large part of her issues, she's married a number of times. Um, a large part of her issues is that she is pining after a young man that she, you know, basically had a crush on for a very long time. So she was very, very young. So we see her grow, throughout the story. Um, something like 20 years of life. And so when we first see her, she's very young. I don't know exactly how old she's supposed to be off the top of my head, but it's clear that she's very young. And so these things actually do have an impact because the reality is, when you have a lot of choices before you, uh, you don't really appreciate each one. So paradoxically, what happens is that you can graduate from college, and then suddenly your standards are not so high or not so particular, right? So you're out there and you kind of realize, okay, there's actually like a lot of there aren't a lot of young women that I could date, but the few of them, you feel a little more drawn to after a while, because in college you're just surrounded, right? You're surrounded by all these young men or these young women, and then of course you have to compare them to each other. And so this is an interesting thing about bringing up Barry Schwartz because he teaches at Swarthmore. And Swarthmore is a very small school, and Swarthmore has a very small ranged of personalities, a small range of personalities among the student population. Not to say that everybody is the same, okay, not to say that everybody is very liberal there, for example, even though most students are, but the kinds of students that are there have a lot more in common with each other than even potentially their own extended family members. Like I think that the people there have more in common with each other as students. The students there have more in common with each other as human beings than they would with their cousins, because it is hard to get into Swarthmore, and they choose people of a particular nature. They're all smart. You know, Swarthmore students are very smart, very intellectual. And so even though they don't necessarily agree on the same political spectrum, okay, there is still for example, a Republicans club there. Um, and there are people who are Christians and so forth, even though most of the student population is liberal and atheist. Um, Even given that, the personalities are very similar, and yet it's not like everybody simply just finds the love of their life there. Uh, because once you're in that kind of situation, you take even though when you were in high school, you're like, well, I just want to find somebody who's very smart and who's who works hard and is open-minded. Okay, now all of a sudden you're there, and all of a sudden everybody around you fits that exact profile. Well, then now you just get pickier, and that's what happens in almost every kind of college situation to various degrees. If you go to a school like you know a typical UC, for example, well, there's a lot of young persons, and you guys have a lot in common, but you guys don't connect, right? The other thing, though, besides the paradox of choice that makes it very difficult, is simply the transient nature of college. And what you have here is realistically, people are there, and they're not there for really that long, and then they leave, and there's not a necessary expectation of marriage. You know, if you decided, okay, I want to I want to get engaged in a couple of years, you're going to be spending your time much more differently. You're going to go and say, okay, you're going to go out there, meet different people, okay, and then you're going to try to be more structured with your time. You're not going to be, just say, hey, let's go ahead and, you know, let's go have dinner at the cafeteria. And then you go to the cafeteria. But since you all go to the same cafeterias anyway, what does that even mean? Right? Is that a step in the romantic direction? Is that it's just a friendship? Nobody knows, right? Nobody knows. So um, then you go to somewhere else, even if there's like a restaurant nearby, there's other students there too, right? There's not really a space that tells you, okay, this is something a little different, okay, and we don't know exactly what this is, but let's start to think about what this could be, right? There's nothing like that. So once you're out of college and you meet somebody and you say, okay, hey, well, would you like to do this? Would you like to go to this restaurant, or would you like to go, uh, I don't know, play tennis or whatever, right? You're spending some time in a place where other young people aren't, that you would not naturally spend time with, right? You're not going to just run into, you know, a bunch of other classmates, in other words, over there. So that facilitates this kind of thought process. But in college, it's just it's unstructured. Okay. So you're in college, and then um, you might not be able to figure out, how to take a step in the right direction, right? And people are not really thinking about that because they're young and they're surrounded by young people, and so it seems like youth is an infinite resource, and because of that, it really gives you the wrong impression. You really feel like you'll be in your 20s forever, and you won't be, and that'll change very quickly. And of course, the worst part about college, the college culture, is that it does not believe that sex is sacred. Okay, it does not believe that intimacy um, matters of a sexual nature. So um, again, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with chastity, right? If you believe in chastity and you understand that time is limited, you're going to be more structured in how you go about these, right? You're going to say, okay, I'm out here. I see a lot of good candidates. Okay, so I'm going to get to know them, and we're going to talk about significant things. We're going to talk about things like how many children do you want to have? We're going to talk about what you think the role of husband and wife are. We're going to talk about um, what's a good community in which to live, or rather a good neighborhood. Um, what are our values, right? What's really important, right? Are we going to have a place that is, you know, quiet, a place where we can have our family rituals? Are we going to do a lot of traveling? Are we going to um, move around the country? There's a lot of things that need to be discussed. And if you were smart about it, you would go out, you would meet a lot of people, right? You would meet a lot of young men or young women, and whoever could be your spouse, and then you would talk about these things, and you would choose to talk to people who you knew that at the very least you find them attractive enough, right? Because you want to be honest. Looks do matter, right? It's not obviously everything. Everybody knows that. It's not the number one thing, and nobody's going to admit to that. But they do matter to some degree. You have to actually, you know, and this is something though, I think that's fair because if you are healthy, if you eat well and exercise well, um, and put in some degree of effort, then you'll be chances are you'll be attractive enough. 90% of the population, you'll be attractive enough to be considered. Okay, to be considered enough that your personality can take the rest of the distance, right? So you don't really have to worry too much about that, you know. But this helps me circle back to the old days because the old days, you would basically be arranged. So you wouldn't be meeting, if you're a young man, you wouldn't be necessarily meeting all these young women. If you're a young woman, you certainly wouldn't be necessarily meeting all these young men, right? So you wouldn't be in a sense spoiled, right? You wouldn't really know what's out there, but that's actually a good thing because most people back then were pretty decent looking. Because why? Because they walked everywhere. They couldn't over. It would be really hard to overeat with the food available back then. Um, they were regularly exercising their muscles. All right, and so they were overall healthy, and that's the major thing that makes somebody attractive, that they're physically healthy. Because if they're not physically healthy, it doesn't really matter. When I was in college, I was not eating well, I was not exercising well, and I was not attractive. And then once I graduated, I could finally eat well, and then I exercised well, and I looked much better, right? And uh, you know, you know, you know how handsome I am, right? So there's a big difference, right? A lot of that is um, simply taking care of yourself. Okay. But anyways, even if you're kind of, 50th percentile of looks, right? That can still work out because it's not like your spouse whom you're arranged to has seen um, a lot of other people. So again, once you're healthy, you're pretty attractive already, like in an objective sense. Maybe not relative to other people, right? Maybe you're not a top 1% or 10% guy or woman, but you're attractive enough to fall in love with, and that's enough, right? Um, so that's we can get into a lot of more other things that made you know marriages of the old times work. Not just gender segregation, but other things like what do women look for, what men look for, and how polygyny might fit into this, or how what is nowadays called hypergamy might fit into this, that kind of thing. But that's not really what you're asking about. You're asking about the college situation. And so the college situation, again, it looks like, just because there's water, water everywhere, right? It doesn't mean that there's any necessarily to drink, right? So when you're thinking about this environment, right, it's not enough that there's water, but it's kind of like what's happening within that water, right? What's going on. It's not the greatest analogy, I'll admit, but my point is, it seems like there's a lot of young men or a lot of young women, but when you actually look to see how people behave, right, they're not taught to be serious about marriage. They feel like they're going to be young forever. They're taught that, sex is about some kind of fleeting enjoyment rather than some kind of very serious, joyful, um, spiritually intense bonding that changes the course of history. Why? Because not only do your personal lives change as individuals, you actually can have children out of this, right? And that literally changes the whole course of history. Okay. So this is something um, that is completely world breaking to do. And so it's not something to be taken lightly, like you're just having a burger, it's just like, I'm just having a really, good slice of pizza, right? That's not really what it should be treated as. Um, but because you have all of this going on, um, finding your spouse in college, that's something that used to be almost taken for granted. But by now, in the 21st century, it has long ago um, not really not really worked out that way. Do you have any other kind of aspects that you've noticed that um, result in obstacles towards meeting your future spouse that people have in general?
Mainly the academic load, like um, a majority of students in college are STEM, and so thus they spend a lot of time uh, preparing for classes, preparing for
Yeah, so
exams.
you're talking about STEM students, right? And you're pinning this on them being busy. And I think there's a larger issue here beyond STEM. I think what this is simply a lack of maturity brought by the general education system that finds itself most intensely in STEM students, but not exclusively to STEM students. So when I teach, right, when I teach high school students, right, through my own program, we spend a lot of time in philosophy because philosophy is the love of wisdom. So we're learning what human nature is, we're learning what is right and wrong, we're learning what is truth, what is beauty, how to come to truth, what constitutes beauty, what is goodness, okay, and what is morally right. So we're studying those, and that naturally, of course, helps you understand how to deal with others. What's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? What makes you look foolish and undignified? What you can do to assert yourself properly and not arrogantly, with dignity, but not allowing yourself to be pushed around, right? How do you read other people? How do you know what's going on in their head, right? How do you deal with that? Okay, who can you trust, and so forth. That's real education. Okay, from the perspective of the ancients, that's true education. Okay, it's not about how do you get one chemical compound to react with the other. That's not really what it's about. But when you go to college and you haven't really had much of an education in high school anyway, then you go to college and you're still a young person and you don't know anything about humanity, right? Hence the humanities, right? It's called the humanities because this all revolves around the human beings, human societies, human uh, psychology, right? Human moments, human feelings, right? Once you go into the STEM and you're no longer even thinking about the human beings and you're spending all your time there, then you still have the maturity of the same person that you were in high school. You didn't grow, okay? Because if it's not taught to you and you don't study it, how are you going to learn about these things, about human nature and right and wrong? You just have to experience life. Well, when you're 20, 22, right, there's not much life to experience or to reflect on, okay? And you have very little experience. And most of that was in this very narrowly structured way of life where you're constantly in class and you constantly study for tests and you're constantly writing papers, and you're constantly putting together projects. It literally retards you as a human being. So it's not really about the raw amount of time that you spend in STEM. It's that you were never really educated, right? Xunzi talks about human nature being bad. What he really specifically means that is not that you could ever not be good. You can be good, but that comes after a lot of hard work and a lot of learning. Whether it's taught to you by a teacher, whether you read it from a text, whether you reflect on decades of life experience, it isn't something that you are just born with. So what you observe here is really just the absolute excess, the absolute end of what it means to lose sight of the meaning of what education is. To understand that human beings are born insufficient, are born foolish, are born ignorant, are born undisciplined, are born, in a word, bad, and that effort needs to be put in so that we do become good, so that we do become wise, so we do become moral. So we do know how to do things of a dignified and beautiful nature. That's what you need to happen. But we don't teach these things almost at all. The closest you get is one English class each semester. And a lot of that English class is just built on things like how do you write a paper? How do you put together a coherent sentence grammatically? How do you put together a coherent paragraph? How do you put together a coherent paper? Those are important skills. But unless we directly talk about what's right and wrong and what human nature is, which, by the way, the humanities these days pretend doesn't exist, right? And that's part of the problem with this sort of, let's just call it generically liberal kind of approach to human nature. This belief that there's infinite diversity out there, and all of it is equally valid, and everybody would be at peace with themselves if it weren't for other people judging them. And that's the incorrect way to understand things. Because if you have the wrong understanding, then even though nobody judges you, you will not be happy with yourself. There will be conflict within you, right? And I think the transgender thing is the most clear example of this, the most extreme example of this, where people just assume that, okay, let's just completely accept this man who is putting on a dress and then going through surgery. Okay. That doesn't really solve the inner conflict within that man's mind and heart. It doesn't, because he is at war with his body and he is at war with his feelings. Okay. And his whole perspective on what gender is, what it means, is fundamentally flawed. He's fixated on the wrong understanding. Okay. Because something like transgender, um, the ancients didn't really conceive of this. They had, you would look at your body, you would understand what it's capable of, okay, and then you would accept that, and then you would know what's important, right? I mean, the people of the past really valued children, right? There's nothing more important than children. So if you have a certain amount, certain set of biological hardware, you would use it in a certain way, okay? Now, in terms of how you behave, it's kind of strange too, because nowadays there's no expectations on gendered behavior. You don't have to, by nature of being a man or a woman, behave in a certain way, right? We're, uh, we're so-called beyond that, or we at least ignore it, right? But um, even given that kind of freedom, even given that kind of lack of judgment, we still have people say, no, I need to change my body. Okay, no, I need to be called this gender. No, I need to go into these areas reserved for this gender. And it really just doesn't make any sense when you're at that point, right? So when you're thinking about um, when you're thinking about these people, there's a huge, great conflict within their own minds, and a lot of that is caused by the way that they perceive gender, right? If you think about gender roles, what is gender roles? It's something that's a role. It's not something that is necessarily who you are. Okay, by that I mean, look, as a son, there are certain things I have to do for my parents, right? Certain ways I have to look at them and respect them and so forth, right? Certain ways that I relate to them. Okay, that doesn't really have much to do with how I am as a husband. Doesn't really have that much to do with how I am um, as a uh, as a father, right? That doesn't really have much to do with what I like to use my free time on, right? Those are duties that I I fulfill, okay, and they're contextual. So let me give you an example, right? A general in the ancient past, he had to be simultaneously obedient and submissive while being a leader, right? While being dominant. Okay, why? Because as a general, to your subordinates, to your lieutenants and so forth, you have to be dominant. You have to be commanding. You have to be decisive. With regards to your king, you have to be submissive. You have to be obedient. So, is a general masculine or feminine? You can't answer that question because the whole West framework on gender is incorrect. There are no such thing as gender roles. There are roles, right? There are roles. Fathers need to be father. That's why Confucius says, right? Let the father's father, let the son's son, let the minister's ministers, let the Lord's Lord. Okay, because Chinese, ancient Chinese could kind of work that way. But the point is, a word is not just a noun; it's also a verb, right? So, um, it's like in English, there's a distinction between, there's a greater distinction between or separation between the noun and the verb, right? But ancient Chinese is a little different than that, right? So, anyways, the point here is that you have a certain kind of role to play, right? And then you need to know what that is. You need to learn how that works. You need to have examples of that. And that goes back to studying because it's not enough to just say to somebody, just in abstract, be kind and courteous and friendly and all these things that you would do for one person, whether he's your friend or he's your brother or he's your father or a stranger, right? You're supposed to behave the same way. And if you don't do that, if you change according to who you are with, you're a phony or a fake or something. And that's so backwards. I mean, that's that's the excess of individualism, right? Like you're one person and you need to find out who that is. And then once you find out who that is, you're just unchanging, like a god or something like that. And that's not really what human beings are, right? We're different and we're different by the relationship we have. And that's lovely. That's wonderful. That's joyful. That brings a multitude, a great variation, a great diversity of experience and happiness into our lives, that we can be different things to different people. But if you insist that you're just one exact person throughout your entire of your life, I mean, you might as well just try to figure out what the perfect meal is and eat that every day because it's not going to work out for you because you're not built for that. Okay. And so if you're born a woman, there are certain things that you could do. You can get pregnant, right? If you're born a man, there are certain things you can and cannot do, right? And so you want to go with that. You want to make use of that. You want to, make the best use of that you can. Because it's not just those parts, by the way. I mean, even if one day science, technology is capable of giving you functional parts of the opposite sex, it's not going to really be the best thing um, because it doesn't just end with those body parts, right? It doesn't begin and end with those body parts, right? There are things about your brain that are a bit different. Um, there are things about there's a lot of nuanced things, you know. And again, if you look at what your duties actually are as opposed to gendered expectations, right? They're not actually as difficult as you might expect. Traditionally in Confucianism, wives are compared to prime ministers. Now, prime minister is a very powerful and important and intelligent person. So when we hear a wife being compared to a prime minister or vice versa, a prime minister being compared to like a wife, we have to understand that, um, their sense of what wifely duty is really different, um, than what we today consider to be a feminine figure, right? Because a lot of what we think about in terms of femininity or masculinity is going to be really different, um, than what was considered in the past. Okay, so the other thing is maybe we should think about it this way: like gender roles are not only real, but what we expect out of men versus women is actually not appropriate to begin with. Okay, but going back to all this, right? Going back to this question about dating in college, and maturity and such, you actually do have to learn how to be these things, and it takes more than just raw experience. It takes the right understanding, right? Like, we all want good relationships with our parents. Okay, a lot of people these days they cut off the relationship with one or both parents, and sometimes in extreme cases that could be necessary, right? It could be something that, um, in very extreme cases, right? And I think you can imagine what that could be. Most of us shouldn't be like this, right? Um, and so when I say this, even that is kind of going off into the wrong direction, because what you want to think about is duties, right? So when it comes to a parent, the parent is not going to be right all the time, obviously. So what do? Do you just obey him anyway? No, you're not actually supposed to do that. That's why Sun Tzu says, follow E, righteousness, not your Lord. Follow the Tao, not your Lord. Okay. The Tao meaning the right way of things. Okay. The good way of things. The true and beautiful way of things. Okay. That's the Tao. It's too large to be adequately described, you know. But anyways, your duty is to get your father to do the right thing, not to indulge him, not to slavishly obey him, but try to get him to do the right thing. Okay. In fact, it's the most disloyal thing, according to Mencius, to just flatter and um, to give in to whatever your Lord wants. Okay. If you really are loyal, you should want to correct your Lord. Okay. If you really are filial, you should want your father to be virtuous, right? And that goes really for any kind of relationship, right? You want the person that you love to be better, right? And if you don't understand that, then of course you won't really understand the rest of us. You'll just kind of be stuck in like, how do I feel around this person? Does he make me happy? Do I have fun around this person? Does he make me mad and sad? Well, it's been a while since I was happy, so I guess I better break up this relationship. And in terms of fixing the relationship, nobody talks about duties either, right? You ought to do this as my, father, mother, son, daughter, husband, wife, these days boyfriend, girlfriend, right? There's no discussion of that, right? Like there's no discussion of, is it really proper for you to go to these certain, especially these certain kind of parties when you have a boyfriend, right? Is it really appropriate to do that? Is it really proper to do that? None of that discussion ever takes place. So people just kind of disorder in a very disordered way go about life. They go to this party, right? Where there's a lot of reckless, parasexual behavior. And lots of problems happen because of that, lots of misunderstanding at the very least. But nobody ever stopped to think, okay, what is actually my duty here? What do I owe? Okay. They also, this is another thing, it needs to be reciprocal, right? It needs to go both ways. Okay? Because if only one side does it and the other side doesn't, then it all falls apart. And I use the word reciprocal because you owe each other different things. Okay, the father owes has a duty to the son that's different from the duties or the obligations or what's owed to the father. They're different. Okay, and so you need to figure out what those are, how to implement it, and then you can start to study literature, and then you can start looking at stories, and then you can look at history, and then you can make sense of these things. Because fundamental to all this is either a misunderstanding of human nature or a misunderstanding of what is morally right, or a combination of the two. That's what brings about tragedy. That's what brings upon collapse. That's what brings upon problems. And the proper understanding of these things is what allows for flourishing, what allows for joy, what allows for stability. That's the proper way to educate. And then you do things like sciences on the side, because they're not core, right? They're not core. Not everybody is going to make use of chemistry. Not everybody is going to build bridges. Not everybody is going to create software programs. Not everybody is going to go into space. But everybody needs to be a human being. So why do we neglect the humanities and gut out the very core of it, right? Studying human nature and figuring out what that is and is not, how it works and how it doesn't work, and understanding what's the right thing and the wrong thing. So does that answer your question here?
I think so, yeah.
Is there
It,
anything else that you want to bring up?
um, yeah, like you said, when it comes, they first focus on STEM, and then if they can, they focus on humanities, and then because of that, it also degrades their ability to interact with other people, which is
To
something you
do
see.
what?
It degrades their abilities to actively interact with others in a productive way. That
Yeah, even the
uh,
word productive is not really the one you want to use in a harmonious way, right?
mhm,
Because there's not necessarily a goal to create something external, right? That's what a process of production does, right? The product at the end of the factory assembly line is different and has nothing to do with the factory once it's completed and shipped. Okay, so even your misusage of words is actually something that's indicative of a problem
mhm,
because when you don't use words correctly, you're not really understanding the full nature of what's going on. Okay. And also you're miscommunicating with others too, right? By saying stuff like productive, you imply there's an external goal to a relationship. Whereas a relationship is good in and of itself. The relationship is the goal, right? It's like talking about a productive poem. There's no such thing. The poem itself is the thing that's lovely. That's the thing to enjoy. We don't talk about productive art because the art itself is a thing to experience. So a relationship, we can talk about beautiful relationships, lovely relationships, harmonious relationships, right relationships, good relationships, but not productive relationships. What is a relationship you want to have? Find somebody with whom you can have that with and work on it. If you don't do that, what you have is a mutual exploitation scheme. And that's how most people go about their relationships. And that's why most people do not get married, even though they move in together, they start to share finances together, even though they might buy a house together, even though they might have children together, because they have the wrong understanding. And then they get divorced because they have the wrong understanding. And I'm thinking, what is the relationship we want to have together? How do we make that work? They didn't think about that. They just get these feelings from this other person, and feelings are always by nature temporary. And what is that ultimately? You're just using the other person as a drug, a fix, an emotional high. And that's a terrible thing. That's not love. That's not care. And that's not anything. You're just taking on a label to make it more socially acceptable to do what you're doing. Anything else here?
Not really. Maybe some advice for college students, uh,
I mean, it's
how to
it's pretty much what
navigate.
I've been saying here, right? It's if you want to know what to do, you want to go find people, get to know them, figure out the important things, and then figure out what a good relationship is, and then start living it. So then you get married, you know, very soon after that, after you know this is going to work out. So nowadays we don't have betrothal, we don't have that kind of thing anymore, right? So you have to take more of the responsibility and burden of making this work, searching out and finding people and getting to know them, seeing who you could trust, right? And that takes some time. But at a certain point, um, you're just practicing either either this person is the right person or you're just deceiving yourself.